overview. I am so happy to assist, to organize that meetup with Oscar, especially really happy because we have Vasco with us from Finland. And Vasco is the founder of a special, very interesting movement called No Estimates. So Vasco has blogs, a lot of YouTube videos and other, a lot of presentation in the media as well. So in our meetup group, we added a lot of links. You can go and see those links if you're more interested. And I will let right now Vasco talk about himself a little bit. And after that, you're free to start the presentation, Vasco. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Kalina. Hi, everybody. Hope you're all safe and helping keep your family and community safe as well. I'm right now in Finland, unable to travel, which is very weird for me. I haven't traveled since March. And this was, I was counting back then, that April was the first full month from the first to the last day that I didn't travel since 2014. So this has represented quite a big change for my usual, for the normal that I usually have. And I guess as everybody has been saying everywhere, we are in a new normal. This has given also quite good opportunities to visit meetups that are elsewhere, like this one. So thank you very much, guys, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share with you guys perhaps a few ideas and definitely a thought that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this, which is that it might be, and of course I'm sure have all heard that we should concentrate on improving how we estimate, but it might be that all attempts to improve estimation will continue to fail. And of course, we are going to talk about what to do instead. But I hope that by the end of this presentation, you are quite convinced that actually estimation is not a good strategy if your goal is to secure an investment, to make sure that the money that is put into your software or otherwise IT project is not going to go to waste. I'll take questions at the end, if you don't mind. This is not going to take too long, as I would rather have this more conversational, so I'll take questions at the end. First thing is, you get a gift just by being here. So if you go to this URL right there, and note that the URL is actually case sensitive. So let me paste that into the chat. I'm just typing it here so that you don't have to. Verifying that it's working, and it is working. So I'll paste this URL into the chat, and you can go there and you will get the whole book for free. There's no catch, it's the whole book, the whole PDF of the book for free. And the reason why I do this, of course, is because I believe that there's a lot we need to do in order to improve our industry. And I believe that No Estimates is part of that, a modest part, but definitely an important part. So this study comes out of Sweden, Aalborg University, of 258 major international transport infrastructure projects. And note that these are not IT projects, right? So it's not IT that is bad at estimates. The projects happened between 27 and 1998, last century, and they found that the actual costs, so this is a retrospective research, so it's done after we know already what has happened. The average actual costs were 28% higher than the estimated costs. So what we can say from this first finding is that estimation is not a good strategy if you cannot afford to lose 20 to 30% of the money you're going to invest in a project. But it gets even better. I say, when I say better, I actually mean worse, of course. And that is that 9 out of 10 of these projects, 9 out of 10, that's 90%, the costs were underestimated, resulting in a cost overrun. There's a name here of the people who did this, who published an analysis of several studies, including this one, and there's a link here if you want to know more. So the first thing is that we have to accept that projects and their related techniques, like estimates, are not the best tool if what you want is to contain costs or hit a particular deadline. And that's what the article clearly shows. And if I were going to translate this into investment advice, I would say, if your aim is to make money with your investment, do not use projects, and definitely do not use estimates to manage those projects. So I took that further and I did a little simulation. This is a toy simulation. Let's imagine I want to look at a project with 10 tasks, right? And I ran that project 1,000 times through a simulator with the expected distribution of cost delays and cost overruns. And this is the number. So this is a frequency histogram, and this is the number of those 1,000, the number of projects that had the perfect estimate. It was around 11, as you can see here, which meant that the probability of a perfect estimate in a 10 task project is around 4.6%. And this is based on a distribution, which is the Weibull distribution, that does not account for some of the phenomena we actually see. So the situation might be a lot worse than this, and I'll get to that in a second. If we wanted to be 50% confident that we would get what we paid for, we would have to multiply the estimates by 2.37. And if we wanted to be 75% confident, that's still a lot of margin for error here, we would have to multiply the estimates by 2.9 times. The median project duration, which is around here, is 12.4. Now, the numbers here require a little bit of explanation. These are 10 tasks, and the simulation assumed that every task had a duration of 1. And then we just did a simulation of the normal delays that happen, and of course, some tasks are delivered ahead of schedule, and it gives us this kind of distribution, right? So median at 12.4, and the 75% confidence interval would require us to have an estimate of 12.9. Now, this is a 10-task project, and I guess you would agree, it's kind of a toy project, right? No project has only 10 tasks. All right, so let's look at the rather small, but not so toy project anymore, of 100 tasks. Let's run that again 100 times, and let's see what's the probability of hitting the perfect estimate. And the probability of a perfect estimate is 0 for 100 tasks, which is a rather small project for any IT project out there. The probability of having the perfect estimate for that project is 0. The probability, or if we want to be 50% confident, we would have to multiply the estimate by 2.4. And if we wanted to be 75% confident, 2.6. So the median project duration here is 124 out of 100. So 25% over the estimated duration. And you can see how the majority of the 1,000 tries concentrates over here, right? So the probability of being on time is 0. All right, so here's the thing. We looked at that, those are 2 examples. And then I took this even further. I said, okay, what if we start with 0 tasks, a project of 0 tasks? What's the probability of being on time? Of course, we didn't start at 0, we started at 1, and that's close to 1. So if you have a project of 1 task, by all means, use estimates. However, if you have a project of just 5 tasks, look at the probability. It's below 20% of hitting the deadline. So that's whatever, like 17%, something like that. If I go to 10, that's even lower. And of course, it rapidly approaches 0, right? So that's what happens. The moment you start growing the number of tasks, the probability of hitting the deadline rapidly approaches 0. At 30, it's practically 0 already. This also tells us that project estimate errors grow faster than the size of the project. And we know this because if they grew at the same speed of the size of the project, we would see a line like this, right? We would see a linear decline in estimation performance, but we don't. We see a logarithmic decline of the performance. So there's this big gap here between what we are told in school and the reality. Estimation quality or the errors of estimation grow much faster than the size of the project. And this is of particular importance for us that work in non-trivial projects, because what this is telling us is that it is very likely that the errors will be so big that it will eventually kill the project. Now, it will not happen for every single one of your projects, but anyone who's managed the project knows perfectly well that having one catastrophic project in your career can be severely damaging for your career. So what we start to understand after looking at this data is that project failure, because of estimation, is a fat-tailed process. And what that means, that it is a fat-tailed process, is exactly this, is that the errors grow much faster than the size of the variable or the variable under study, which is in this case is the size of the project, right? So the errors grow much faster than the size of the project. If the cost overrun is systemically fat-tailed, we have to understand that estimation does not provide understandable or even plannable errors. The errors of estimation can be huge, and they can be huge in a way that even one single error for one task or one work package in a project can destroy the whole project. That's what fat-tailed means. Because the errors are not equally distributed among tasks, we then have to accept that estimation, not being a good way to detect what's called one-offs or black swans in terms of estimation error, is definitely not a good technology for us to base the success of our projects on. And by the way, this is a statement from this paper here. There's a lot more data coming, but if you want to study that, you can go and check that out. And we know this intuitively when we just start looking at the projects out there. The bigger the projects, the worse the estimates. Like, for example, the F-35, which is in 2018 already projected to go to 1.5 trillion US dollars, or the Berlin Ghost Airport, the Brandenburg Airport, which started with a 2.4 billion US dollar budget and has or had grown last year already to 8.5 billion dollar budget, which is of course huge. But there is a solution. There's something we can use instead, and that is something we have learned from analysis of network throughput. You can see that networks, which are quite complex systems, have, however, a very stable throughput behavior. And of course, that's when the networks are not under severe load, for example. When we look at the software team and the throughput they have, so items completed per unit of time, we see the same behavior. We see that it goes up and down, but it's rather stable. There's some limits to the variation, and we can very much predict over time what their delivery will be, just like we can in telecommunications networks. So what I'm talking about here is to shift our perspective. Instead of trying to open the box and try to pick all the items in the box, the tasks in the projects, and explicitly try to assess the size of every single one of those tasks, what I'm suggesting is that just by looking at the throughput of your team and validating that it is stable, and if it's not, then you need to look at what are the reasons why it's not, but assuming it is stable, which is the case in all of the teams that I've studied, then we can definitely know how many items a particular team will deliver per unit of time. Our rate of delivery will be the same or stable over time unless significant changes happen in the team or the system. And if they do, this is the most important part, if those changes happen, we can find out what they are. And we can exert the ability of management to modulate the system so that the team can go back to a stable state. Now, if we know the progress, the rate of delivery, and we know at all times how many work items we have in our backlog, then we can do something very simple, which, I mean, many of you guys have already seen this. This is a burn down. The particular aspect of this burn down is that it only counts the number of stories delivered. It does not, or the number of stories in the backlog, not the size, just the number of stories. And we can see that if we follow the normal progress of a backlog and knowing what the rate of delivery is, like I suggested before, we have an optimistic, pessimistic, and then an optimistic delivery rate, and the reality will be somewhere here. This is our range of possible delivery dates. And we can know this by just looking at the rate of delivery that the teams have. In the No Estimates book, we talk about what you need to get to this trustworthy analysis of the rate of delivery, and therefore also to be able to make predictions without interrupting the team, without getting them into a meeting, an estimation meeting, every time the backlog changes. In fact, one of the things I usually tell the teams that I work with is that the moment you establish this, you can actually get the product owner to do all of the what if scenarios they want, because they have the data, they have the model, they can do their what ifs without interrupting the team. And this is very important because, of course, the goal of product owners is to come up with the best possible product from the customer's perspective. And that means doing a lot of what if scenarios, like what if we do this and that, and when can we deliver, right? That's the question our teams are always asked, when can we deliver? Now, imagine if the product owners would go to the teams with all of the what if scenarios they have in mind. It would, of course, overwhelm the teams in estimation meetings and discussions and so on. And we don't want that. So we talk about how to establish a trustworthy backlog. So what kind of things should you have in your backlog, how to make sure you have those things there. We talk about how to track the rate of delivery, how to use those data points to forecast without estimating. So no interruption to the team, no guessing about the future. And then finally, we talk about scope management for software projects, which is the only option, the only solution to deliver on time. Now, the book is available in this URL. You can go to the chat window and find the URL there. I'm just going to paste it again for those that joined us after I pasted it before. So it's right there. You can go and download the whole book. So no catch, it's the whole PDF. Now, before we finish though, I have a bonus for you. And here's the bonus. I recently discovered a master thesis that basically corroborates the demonstration I showed you, but it's with data from 3,000 projects. The whole thread where I go through the details of that thesis is here, but I'll explain some of the highlights now. So first one, the outliers, meaning the things that are so late, the projects that are so late that the researchers will call them outliers and therefore ignore them in all of their studies, are so frequent, the study says, or the thesis says, outliers are so frequent that the noise drowns out the signal in the data. And by the way, this is one of the characteristics of fat-tailed distributions. What this is telling us is that very likely the errors of estimation do not follow a normal or Gaussian distribution. They follow a fat-tailed distribution. My own assumption is that they follow a power law, which is what I tried to demonstrate when I showed you this slide here, right? Because here we see that the errors grow much faster than the size of the project. That's one of the basic characteristics of a power law distribution. But there's more. This is just one of the highlights. Kmart may have gone bankrupt, at least in part, due to a failed single 1.4 billion USD IT project. This is definitely one more case where estimation did not help a company. In fact, it probably killed the company. The assessment in the thesis is that a lot of the losses, a big chunk of the losses that Kmart experienced can be explained by the growth in size of the IT modernization effort. You can see that the IT project is 1.4 billion and the loss that Kmart posted was 244 million. So the IT project was definitely much bigger than the loss they experienced. And finally, the last one of these highlights, or the face palm, researchers, and that means estimators, when faced with a large amount of extreme, and this is important here, extreme cost and schedule overruns in IT projects, choose to ignore those. I'm not kidding you. This is what is written in that thesis. Researchers, when they look at a body of data and they find a large amount of extreme cost and schedule overruns, choose to ignore those in the studies that they then publish. They only use, it's not that there aren't other data points, it's just they only use the observations that fit the normal distribution, which is thin-tailed. And that's a classic error. When you use only the data that fits a specific distribution you have in mind, like the one I used, which is bad enough, Weibull, or even worse, the normal or Gaussian distribution, what happens is that they hide the real errors of estimation, and the real errors are really fat-tailed. And what this means in practice is that we are telling the whole industry that estimation works when the data we are already looking at tells us the opposite. And we would know that if it were not for researchers to consistently hide the bad news by ignoring the extreme cost and schedule overruns in IT projects. So I submit to you that the only reason why we still use estimates today is because the people who are responsible for improving the craft of estimation staunchly refuse to accept that there's enough evidence out there to show that estimation as a method to secure your investment in your IT project is not working at all. So now I open up for questions. Then we can have a more detailed debate about some of these points. So let me know how you want to do this, Kalina. Do you want to take questions or?
So we have,
well, yeah? Okay, you can. Yeah.
We have a few questions so far, Vasco, so we can go through those questions. And after that, if people want to ask questions directly, we can let them do that. Is that okay for you?
Perfect.
Okay, so the first question is, when was this idea first proposed? Wasn't this something suggested by Zuyo and Neil Killick back in 2013? Just curious.
Yeah, so Woody Zuil is the initiator of the hashtag #NoEstimates. But the idea of stopping to use estimates is much older than that. The Twitter conversation under the #NoEstimates hashtag did start with one tweet by Woody Zuil. My own hashtag for this same ideas was started a few years before, I believe 2 years before, under a hashtag called EstWaste. So hashtag EST waste. That stood for, at that time, estimation is waste. After that, the rest is history. The market loved #NoEstimates hashtag and ignored the EstWaste hashtag, and that's fine. So That's why this is these days the no estimates movement.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, do we need to have equally sized stories to be able to use the no estimates, like the number of items for predictions?
Yeah, so that's a question I get all the time. And the answer to that is no, you don't need. Let me just go back to the slide where I talk about network throughput. This particular graph that you see below, it's a graph for a team. There's about 3 years of data for this team. And the items for this team are not sized at all. So we don't actually know, except in retrospect, how long they take to deliver. And in fact, this team even goes as far as not even tracking how much time they put into the items. They only track how many items they deliver per unit of time, which for them it's items per day. So in fact, once we have data like this, we don't need to know what the size of the items is. We don't need to know. Now, that is not to say that there's no importance to the size of the items. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that over time, so more than a couple of sprints, over time, the sizes will oscillate in size more or less the same way. Let's just use concrete example here. If we're talking about user stories, some user stories will be 3 days, others will be 9, others will be 7, depends on the size of your sprint, because of course, if you have a sprint of 1 week, your user stories will tend to be smaller. If you have a sprint of 3 weeks, your user stories will tend to be bigger. That's just natural because we usually try to finish the stories within 1 sprint. But that's a natural thing. It happens just because we have a time box that we are trying to adhere to. But throughput metrics are valid also for teams that don't have sprints. Kanban teams use throughput and cycle time metrics all the time. And for example, cycle time is an average measure of the elapsed time for a specific story that does not need to take into account the specific size of one story, because it represents the size of all of the stories, or I should say that an arbitrary story from the backlog, right? And this is why, for example, in Kanban, they also use lead time, right? So we are talking about answering other questions. While cycle time is the elapsed time on a story, you may be more interested to know when is item number 3 on the backlog going to be delivered? And that would be lead time, right? So from the moment that something is added to a specific position on the backlog to the moment that it is available in the market or for a customer or something like that. All of those, though, have one characteristic. They are collected data over time that is constantly and naturally kept up to date. So, for example, if the team composition changes, it's quite normal that the story size changes. And that's okay, because we keep that data up to date. We know the throughput, we know the cycle time, we know the lead time all the time. And therefore, all our forecasts are automatically adjusted without having to go and interrupt the team and have God knows how many estimation meetings about it. And there's one thing I feel particularly strongly about, because the problem that the estimating community has not solved is the bootstrap problem. And the bootstrap problem goes like this. The number of stories you have in your backlog at the start of your project is never the number of stories you deliver at the end of the project. Could be more, could be less. Usually it is a lot less than what you deliver at the end. Why? Because in the backlog, there are some items we will break down. There will be new things we discover. In the book, I call that value discovery, unlike the estimators, which typically call that scope creep. I don't call it scope creep. I call it value discovery, because you discover value as you try to deliver items. So the bootstrapping problem tells us that unless you know all the stories for sure that you will deliver, and that your understanding of those stories will never change from the beginning to the end of the project, your estimation is worth 0. Because it's enough for some of the stories to change in meaning, or for more stories to be added for the estimation having to be done all over again. And the reality is that there's no team on the face of this planet that will go and re-estimate everything in the backlog every time some new important information comes to light during the project. That would be brainless. That would be huge waste. Nobody does that. But that would be a required and coherent activity for all of those that argue that estimation is a good technique. You look around, nobody does that, which means that no matter what people say, in practice, no one believes in estimates, not even the estimators. Otherwise, they would force the teams to re-estimate everything. You broke something down, we need to re-estimate the stuff you broke down. You sliced the story, we need to estimate all the items of that story. We added a new story to the backlog, we need to estimate that story. Also, if that story happens to change the architecture, you now need to re-estimate all the stories affected by that change in the architecture. No one does this, which means that in practice, no one actually believes estimation is useful.
What about new teams? Mariana is asking. You don't have historic data, so how do you start with new teams?
Yeah, so my answer to that is 3 sprints is all you need. And if you need to have an answer much faster, you deliver every day. And then you, after 3 days, you have your throughput numbers. But it depends. Most teams are not in that situation, right? Most teams are working on something that is not started yesterday. It's something they have been working on for a few months. So they have that data. Furthermore, there's another aspect, which is that teams do not exist in isolation, and the throughput of one team is not enough for us to understand the throughput of the whole project. In fact, one can even say that adding a new team to a new project might not change the throughput at all. It might change it, it might not change it. So we can start from the assumption that it did not change it, and then adapt our throughput and therefore our forecasts as we learn more about the system. One of the aspects of no estimates is that we apply in practice the concept of empirical process. It's not, estimation is not empirical. There's nothing empirical about trying to predict how long something will take in the future. That's not being empirical. Empirical is understanding what we have been able to deliver just now or the last few sprints and using that as the data to base our forecasts on. That's empirical. We know that when teams change, team members change, architecture changes, technology changes, the throughput will be affected. We know that. And no one sits down and starts re-estimating the whole backlog when that happens. Throughput gives us an immediate and always up-to-date view of how the system is behaving. And by system here, I mean everything. All the teams, the delivery, the testing aspects, the quality of the requirements definition, all of that is seen through the throughput numbers, right? So it's important to acknowledge that throughput is a systemic measure. Estimation is not systemic. It is team-centric. It is even, in some cases, individual-centric. And as we know, a lot of the time an item spends active on your sprint backlog in the to-do column or in progress column, a lot of the time is just waiting. Nobody's working on it. When was the last time you had an estimation conversation about the time we are not going to be working on this item? Because that can be up to 80 or 90% of the time the item is alive, even after we started working on it. I'm not counting the queuing time yet. The queuing time is even more important than that. The queuing time can be, I mean, I usually ask people, maybe I'll ask it right now. How many of you, please say yes on the chat, how many of you have removed an item from your backlog that was at least 3 months old? Just type yes on the chat. All right, quite a lot of people. How about, how many of you have removed an item from your backlog that was 1 year old? You can type yes, 1. Okay. How about 2 years old? You can type yes, 2. All right, I'll go a bit further now. 5 years old? All right, no one took 5 years old. I have asked this at conferences that I go to, and I have had people keep their arm raised until I ask items that are 7 years old. Now that's granted not the most common. The most common is something around 3 or so. But imagine you're the product owner and John is the developer, and you ask John, hey John, how long do you think this item will take? And John will, with the best intent and as honestly as possible, say, I think it takes about 2 weeks. And then you as the product owner, you come back 3 years later and you ask John, but John, you said 2 weeks. It's been 3 years now. And of course, John has to reply, wait a minute, you didn't ask me how long the item would be on the backlog. You only asked me how long it would take me to deliver it once I start working on it. Right? Difference between cycle time and lead time. And we don't know what we're talking about. Most estimation conversations are not making this simple distinction. Are we talking about lead time or cycle time? And that is a critical distinction.
So Vasco, we have a lot of questions in the chat. Maybe if we can go to the next question, it will be good. Jean-Christophe, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, it was just a comment regarding Kanban approach. You know, you are discussing about the fact that definitely there is a way of managing the flow, the throughput, and my question is more about how do we implement that? I mean that we need to have a kind of ways of deploying, because we need to have some kind of interface, you know, with the whole company at large. We cannot say we no more estimate and that's it like that. We do that. It's not working. So my thinking is just about, you know, having some kind of facade, you know, some kind of between, you know, stuff between to give something to the PMO and company. So how do we go there? And I just doing a relationship with Kanban approach.
Yeah, so Jean-Christophe, I would say you go there by quitting your job and going to a better company. But if you don't want to go there, if you don't want to quit and go to a better company, there's a lot of things you can do. For example, there's a lot of companies these days that are using story points. So the team can give a randomly distributed number of story points to all of the stories. And this is okay. It's perfectly okay. And it's perfectly coherent because on average, all stories are the same size. That's what it means to have a cycle time, right? So over time, the number of story points you deliver will also be stable if the distribution of story points is homogeneous between all the stories you have. And some of the teams that I have worked with started their journey by just doing that, by just giving 1, 2, or 3 story points to the stories. And some even just gave always 3 points to the stories. And guess what? Nobody noticed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a technique you could use. Just give 3 to every story.
Is it okay for you, Jean-Christophe?
Yeah, sorry, I'm lost with my...
So quick question, since we're on the topic, so are you saying that sizing story is okay? Isn't that estimating as well?
No, I don't know where you got that. I said that you don't need to size stories. You can attribute a random number between 1 and 3 to the story.
Okay.
There's another question. There's another question for Sylvie. Sylvie, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me? Yes.
Can everyone mute himself if you're not speaking? Thank you.
Yeah, you know, how can I explain this? Ideologically, I follow you wholeheartedly, okay? Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, even when I was project managing in classical waterfall method, okay? In terms of the whole issue about estimates. But the reality is right now is that we collectively, all across the world, are entering in very volatile and difficult economic times, okay, probably for the next 24 months. You know, what I'm reading in terms of specifically expenses in IT as a whole, not only software development, there's a lot of question mark from the the CTIO and then obviously CEO and CFO. So my point to you is as follows. How do you go about and sell this, to the executives who are going to be very, very hard pressed right now, as I said, until we're back to some sort of a stability from economic perspective, and they're anticipating 24 months right now, best guess. How do you sell that to those who are responsible for the numbers? Whether you're in open capital markets or closed capital markets, at one point some people will have to, en français on dit rendre des comptes, okay, settle accounts. So how do you sell that going forward?
All right, I'm just putting a, there we go. I'm putting a link to a podcast on the chat. And the link to that podcast is exactly about how to settle accounts in a software organization. And what we talk about in that podcast is that the idea of capitalizing projects, i.e. defining them fully and defining the investment level up front, is bankrupt. And all companies, the data that I showed right here, all companies that try to use waterfall project and estimation as a way to secure their investment are going to suffer the most in tight economic scenarios. By contrast, companies that are willing to, and of course able and ready to start measuring their throughput, doing continuous delivery, doing small incremental delivery to the point, and that's what I tell everybody, you go down to having stories being delivered to staging every half day. If you're there, you're okay. Any more than that, you're increasing your errors exponentially, which is what this slide shows. The errors of estimation grow exponentially with size of the project. So the smaller the story, the easier it is to control costs. And in that podcast, we talk about the concept of operationalizing the expenses. We should have, IT should be an OPEX and not a CAPEX way of managing financing. And what that means basically is we already have the engineers in the company. We are going to continue to deliver after this project, probably the same product or the same service over and over again. So it's actually an operational expense. It's not a capital expense. And what that means in practice for us as project managers, scrum masters, product owners, is that we need to start delivering more value in smaller chunks and measuring our ability to do so by using very simple metrics like lead time, cycle time, and throughput, rather than trying to predict upfront, months, sometimes years upfront, what will be needed later, and then trying to cram that all into a one-pass waterfall, which is what most agile teams still work on. They get into the project after everything's been decided, including the estimates have been decided. So especially for companies under financial distress, go smaller, increase the frequency of feedback, deliver smaller increments, deliver every day or at least every sprint to the market, collect feedback and manage the investment from an OPEX perspective rather than the CAPEX perspective. I.e., don't put onto the future the gains, put onto the present the gains. That's what I do in my business. And if I hire someone and they tell me, I need to write down everything we are going to deliver and I need to estimate, and then I'm going to ask you for money, I would tell that person, you're fired. I've been a project manager. I know it doesn't work because I've learned through Agile that the best way to control costs is to deliver all the time and turn off the tap when there's no more value to be delivered. Stop the project when enough value has been delivered.
Vasco, as an IT person, you're preaching to the choir, okay? But there's two elements that that you seem to elude you. First of all, CapEx are more.
Don't hear you, Sylvie.
I think we
Yeah.
lost Sylvie. Could you repeat?
It's lost you.
Okay,
She's
can you hear
back.
me now?
Could you repeat,
Yeah,
please?
we can hear you now.
Okay, as I said, as an IT person, you're preaching to the choir here, okay? But first of all, there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind here. CapEx are a lot more attractive from a financial perspective, fiscal perspective, to any CFOs and CEOs right now, okay? Which basically, not all of them, but the majority of them will be scraping the bottom of the barrels, and the ones listed on the stock markets, irrespective of where they are, will have to be very diligent and rigorous in what they're announcing every quarter, because if not, their little hands are going to slap. This has not been felt yet, because I can speak for Canada and I think the majority of Europe. There's still a lot of federal money being injected into the economy, but when that tap closes, the reality is going to hit. Okay,
Yeah,
so yeah,
So,
putting
Sylvie,
everything in OpEx is just not attractive for them.
yeah, no, I understand. I don't think that this conversation is necessarily restricted to a tough economic time. As an investor, if I see a line that says goodwill, I say goodbye. And the reason for that is very simple. Business plans are fiction. CapEx is fiction. It doesn't exist in reality. So if I want to save my money, I'm going to go OpEx. If it's somebody else's money, then I can decide, maybe I use it, maybe I don't. And I can also decide, look, I don't really want to work in this company. But listen to the podcast. There's a financial controller in the podcast explaining these topics. The fact is that in tough economic times, using CapEx as the model to finance IT projects is completely irresponsible, as the Kmart project so well illustrates. And there's more. There's Lidl, who stopped an IT renovation project after 700 million euros were invested. And they threw it to the garbage, straight to the garbage.
Yeah, and as I said, as an IT person, I hear you. We've had Phoenix here, which is the federal public sector payroll system. I think it's going to end up costing taxpayers 22 billions or something, okay? As I said, I hear you. I will listen to the podcast. When was it produced?
I believe it was recorded last year, but you have the date on the podcast.
I'll go and check it. Thanks for your time. I gotta go. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye, Sylvie.
Bye-bye.
We have a question from Sebastian Tart. I'm not sure, Sebastian, if your question is answered already. Sebastian? Maybe he left. So let's move on.
Sorry.
Yeah?
Do you hear me?
Can you? Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for the mute, but yes, it has been answered. Basically, the answer is no, do not need to estimate each story based on what I've heard so far.
That's perfect.
You check the book for more details.
I will, because it's a big change on my side.
We have a question from Imtiaz. Imtiaz, do you want to ask your question?
Sorry, which question was it? I can't remember what I posted.
Bootstrapping problem.
Oh yeah, so just a quick comment. The host is, when you mentioned the bootstrapping problem, in the context that you mentioned, to me it would just seem like more of a delivery issue than an estimation issue, right? So just wanted your feedback.
Yeah. So no, but bootstrapping problem is exclusively an estimation problem. If you don't know everything that is going to the backlog, estimation is worth zero. So the first problem is you need to get everything into the backlog, otherwise you can't estimate it. And then the other problem is that even if you get everything into the backlog, your understanding of the items in the backlog will change over time. Therefore, your estimate should change over time, but it doesn't. It remains the same. So the bootstrapping problem illustrates how estimation is logically, internally incoherent. It makes no sense. Once you start to logically analyze the premises behind estimation and you see how teams work in practice, you see that no one, even the people who advocate estimation, actually does estimation as it should be done.
Okay, so just a clarification for the whole context of what you're presenting. What I'm unclear about, and there are certain situations where I agree with you, estimation is just not working, you know, many situations in certain areas, depending on the team size, how mature they are, how small they are, if there's a contract or not involved. But in some cases, and I agree with you, you know, the whole waterfall approach of estimation has failed. But then again, I heard you say that, you know, agile is probably a solution to some of that problem. But then I'm confused when you say, okay, estimate it, but don't estimate it within agile as well. So I'm not sure what the whole,
Okay,
what are you advocating?
I'm advocating precisely what the book says, which is stop using estimates if what you want is to secure your investment, is to know what can be delivered and when. The book goes through quite a lot of detail of explaining how you would turn around a waterfall project into a no estimates project. So I do recommend that you go through that. Just to be very clear, what I did say is that you already have metrics that can help you assess the rate of delivery, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you remember, we talked about using the rate of delivery to just picking the backlog, doing a very simple burn down, and then knowing when you're going to deliver. This is done by just looking at data, not interrupting teams. And of course, most important, this is always up to date. If you change the stories in the backlog, this is up to date. If the product owner wants to do 20, 30 what if scenarios, they can do this on their own without interrupting the team, which is a huge advantage for the product owner and also a peace of mind for the development team, which now does not need to spend half of their week in estimation meetings.
Okay, yeah, so I agree there that estimation done way up front is probably useless. Things will change. A better way to measure is how things are changing over time, whether you measure your cycle time, lead time, all that good stuff, throughput. So I do agree with that response as well. I was just confused that, so you're saying still estimate it, but in not the way you would estimate it through budgets.
No, okay, so Imtiaz, I would invite you to read the book. There's a very important section in the book where we talk about the use of forecasting versus estimation, right? You don't ask a weatherman to estimate the weather. You ask them to forecast the weather. There's a very specific difference between those two. A forecast implies the existence of a model, something that exists outside our brain, that can be improved with experience and knowledge. That's a forecast. An estimate is what I think based on my experience that something will take. What I think based on my experience is firmly inside my head. It cannot be externalized and it cannot be deliberately improved with data. It can be improved by chance and accident, or as we call it, experience, but it cannot be improved by data. So it's enough for one person in the team to change, for the system to change. A forecast is a model of, or it's the outcome of using a model of the system. An estimate has no model of the system. In fact, for example, when you ask a team member to tell you how long something will take, that team member is not considering how long it will take in the backlog, how long it will be waiting for somebody to test it or somebody to release it to staging or to production. That's not possible because that team member does not have all of those steps in their model since they don't do those steps. But in a forecast, we have that. If we use throughput, and this is very important to reiterate, if we use what we've already learned from telecommunications networks, we don't need to sit down people and start guessing with the crystal ball how long something will take. And I believe that we have time for one more question, then we need to end.
It's 12:59, so I'm not sure if we have time. Right. It depends on you, actually.
No, that's okay. We can end here. I mean, you guys can go and download the book if you're interested. There's a lot more detail in the book on how to start adopting those ideas and put them in practice. And if you have questions, feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, I just want to add that Vasco has some video podcast. Don't hesitate to go on YouTube. He has many video and podcast. Interesting. I recommend to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vasco, for being here. Really interesting session. So a lot of positive comments, a lot of questions. So thank you so much for your time. We appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.